When you think about the Georgia Bulldogs football program under Kirby Smart, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? I'm assuming you said the defense, of course. With that in your head, what is the most important position? What is the most important statistical metric heading into 2025 that's going to determine whether or not Georgia's going to be a good football team, whether or not they can actually compete for championships? We're going to talk about that and a lot more on this edition of the How About That Dogs Cast. I got to tell you, the data seems to point in a very, very clear direction that if Georgia wants to do what we all want them to do, which is compete for the SEC and then get into the 12 team or 14 team or whatever it turns out to be, playoff, college football playoff moving into the future, and actually have a chance to win the thing, there's one particular set of information that stands out above all the others. Defense wins championships. So keep that question in your mind, because I'm going to come back to it on the other side. We're going to come back to it at the end, and I'm going to have another question for you. I'm interested in whether or not your idea, your answer from that first question is actually going to change by the time we get to the end. If Georgia wants to win championships, if Georgia wants to be the team that Kirby Smart wants them to be, if they are going to be the team that we all know them to be, then the thing that has to improve is their rush defense. I'm going to walk you through it. We're going to go through a whole lot of numbers tonight. I'm going to try not to get everybody's eyes glazed over. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet, but make the point that if Georgia's going to be who we want them to be, it starts up front, and it starts with how well they play the run as a unit. There are a lot of defensive statistics that people throw around that all of them are very important, and depending on what sort of dynamic you want to make, what you're looking at, right, what it is you're trying to prove, well, one might be more important than the other. And you all know them. They're the usual suspects, right? It's rush defense, it's scoring defense, it's red zone defense, it's third down defense. Can you get after the passer? What are your tackles for loss? Statistics and numbers everywhere. But as in football, and you've heard me say this over and over and over, football, as in life, it's never just one thing. It's all those things, and they all fit together. Just like it's not just defense that plays for the University of Georgia. There's also an offensive side of the football as well as special teams, and we all know that Kirby really, really prides himself and his program on being a balanced, complementary style football team. So, again, it's not one thing. It's all those things coming together, but the numbers are clear. There's one thing that the Dogs have to get better at, and that is stopping the run. If they don't do that, then regardless of how much we might want them to do well, ultimately win those championships, odds are it's not going to happen. And again, the numbers are going to tell that tale. So let's get to the beginning of it here. Let's take a look at the last four national champions. Let's look at 24-23, then the Dogs in 22 and 21 to get a very clear view, very crystallized view of just how important it is to play not only great defense, but great run defense if you want an opportunity to win a national championship. In 2024, we all know the Ohio State Buckeyes took home the title. We heard a lot about Jeremiah Smith and the offense and Will Howard and how he played in the playoffs. But what was the backbone of that team? Did you know that Ohio State statistically finished number one overall in defense in 2024? And they only gave up 12.9 points per game. Overall number one defense, 12.9 points per game. National championship. What about the year before? Michigan, 10.4 points per game. Overall defense, number one. We all know that Michigan team, really good defensively, pretty good offensively. Not dominant, right? Pretty good. Better than average. But that defense, though, they knew what they were about. National championship. And then, of course, in 22, you have Georgia, 15-0. They gave up quite a bit more, actually, in points per game, 14.3 points per game in 2022. And they only finished with the 5th overall ranked defense that year. Top 5 unit. Really good against the run. In 22, the Dogs only give up 77 yards a game on the ground. And then they got a little help from their friends. The offense chimed in with 41 points a game. So who cares that they gave up a couple points more than Michigan did in 24? Who cares that they weren't the overall number one defense? They were still really, really good, but the offense took care of what they couldn't. National championship. And if you look back at 2021, Georgia, the best defense in recent memory, the defense that had every starter drafted into the NFL, they allowed 10.2 points per game. Overall number one ranked defense in the nation. National championship. The numbers are clear. If you want to win titles, you have to play great defense. It's not an automatic indicator that you're going to win. But if you don't, then it's an automatic indicator that you won't. Few teams have what Georgia had in 2022. That team was a monster. 15-0. Yeah, they gave up 14 points a game defensively. Half the time it was because they seemed they weren't interested. But it didn't matter because the offense rolled out there and put up 41 every time. Right? That's what it is. Complementary football. So if you want to win national championships, if you want to be a serious contender on something other than just your recruiting rankings or what you did in the portal, then you have to show up and play great defense. And if Georgia wants to get back to playing for the big golden football, the big golden trophy from the CFP, if Kirby wants to hoist that sucker again, then they're going to have to get back to playing elite defense. And more specifically, elite rush defense. Let's just start with 2024 and touch on these numbers really quick, because in 2024, Georgia allowed 129 yards rushing per game, technically 130, 129.6 rushing yards per game. That placed them at 36th in the nation in that statistic. 36th. Now, total defense, when you measure it by scoring, which is the way I choose to measure it because that's how games are won and lost, right? It's not about yardage given up. It's about how many points go on the board. Is the other team hanging a crooked number? And how often do they cross into the end zone? So, in scoring defense in 2024, Georgia finished 23rd. Let's go back to 2016. Kirby gets into Athens. There's a whole lot of change. He's got to turn over the roster. He's trying to get his people in there. And in that freshman effort for Kirby Smart, Georgia allowed 143.7 yards per game on the ground. That was good for a 36th place finish at the end of the year nationally in run defense. 36th. What did I just say? In 2024, Georgia finished 36th. The difference, of course, between 2016 and 2024 is that in 2016, they had to fight and scrap for everything they got, including a bowl win. In 2024, Georgia came into the season as the number one ranked team in the country and finished the season as SEC champions. So, again, if you're talking about a Kirby Smart defense, we're talking about a group that you expect to be better than the 36th ranked rush defense in college football. That number just doesn't even seem to compute. But because of where the program was in 2016 versus where the program was in 2024, even with the 36th ranked rush defense, they were still able to win an SEC championship. It's kind of mind-boggling, especially when you think about all the struggles that they had on the offensive side of the football this year. But if we start to walk through the years and we move on from 2016, we see that in 2017, Georgia was a little bit better, allowing 126 yards per game on the ground. And you start to see the kind of players that Kirby Smart's bringing in. You start to see guys coming onto campus by 2018, like Jordan Davis. And in 2018, they allowed 134 yards on the ground. That was good enough for 31st in the country in rush defense. Now, the thing about 2017 is you could tell they were better than 2016. Kirby, they'd gotten their system in place. They had started to play better defense. They won an SEC title in 2017. They played for a national championship with the 20th ranked rush defense. Then in 2018, the numbers went back up, 134. They finished 31st ranked in the nation. But then we move into 2019, right? 2019, things really sort of clicked into place. A couple of years in the program, everybody knows what they want to do. They had some good players on the defensive line, some veteran players. Georgia rolls out there, and they only give up 74.9 yards per game on the ground. That was good enough for first in the country in rush defense. In 2019, the Dogs finished first in the country in total defense based on scoring. Then in 2020, the year that we all wish we could forget, but we can't, and everything seems sideways, the numbers sort of skewed a little bit for Georgia there too, because they dropped from first all the way down to 17th in total scoring defense. And they maintained the fact that they were the best team in the country against the run by finishing first, allowing only 72.3 yards per game on the ground. You're like, how can that be the case? How is it that you can finish 2020 17th in the country in total defense and number one against the run, and then not even play for the SEC championship? This is a weird year. Weird stuff. But again, by this point, you've got players like Jordan Davis on campus. You've got players like Nolan Smith on campus rolling into 2021. And we all know what happened there. Georgia pretty much went scorched earth when it comes to the defensive side of the football. They allowed 78.9 rush yards per game on the ground, right? In 21. That was good enough for second in the country overall. In total defense, the Dogs finished first based on scoring. So Georgia had started to find their groove defensively. This is how we all know who and what Georgia is under Kirby Smart. Once he got his players in position on campus, once he got his scheme fully implemented, the Dogs went from allowing 144 yards a game all the way down to a low of 72.3 in 2020. And then they hovered there. So 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, Georgia's allowing 70 some odd yards a game on the ground. What happens in 2021? National championship. What happens in 2022? 77 yards on the ground. The number one ranked rush defense in the country. The number 5 ranked total defense in the country. SEC championship, national championship. So they were doing it both in the run game and against the pass. That's how you end up number 5 overall. But the bottom line was, at this point, everybody knows you don't run the football on a Kirby Smart defense. That's not how you're going to be successful when you got dudes like Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith on the field. It's just not going to happen. Maybe they weren't as flashy as the 21 defense, but they were plenty good in 2022. And then in 2023, things slipped again. Things shifted and didn't look the way we were used to them looking. I mean, yes, you had a future Butkus Award winner in Jalen Walker on that unit. But in 23, the Dogs, that number ticked back up, and it wasn't a small tick. They went from 77.1 on the ground in 22 all the way up to 113, 114 on the ground in 23 per game. That dropped them all the way down to 20th in the country, from first to 20th against the run in one offseason. Now, again, at this point, Georgia has been hit massively by the draft. They've been hit massively at this point where you have the transfer portal starting to factor in. Maybe your depth isn't as good. You can see it happening. But the trend was over. After 4 consecutive years of allowing only 4 or in the 70s per yard, 70s as far as yards per game were concerned on the ground, Georgia jumped all the way back up to 113. But in 23, we still had Brock Bowers. We still had Ladd McConkey. We still had a Carson Beck who had found himself and was producing. We still had a run game where you had dual backs that were healthy for the most part of the season. So the offense made up for some of that, right? Georgia were great in a regular season. They lose one game, they don't even get to play for the national championship. So it was a give and take. Offense was sort of helping the defense out. And then we get to 24, where I started this conversation, and that number moves up again from 114 all the way back up to 130, and a 36th place finish in rush defense for the Georgia Bulldogs. The worst performance for a Georgia Bulldog defense under Kirby Smart since his first year in Athens. It's more than just a trend. Trends by themselves don't tell the full story, because again, this worst defense under Kirby Smart, all they did was roll out there and win another SEC championship. But you can see here that when Georgia was at their very best, when Georgia was making their bones under Kirby Smart, when the nation took, when they actually paid attention to Georgia, it started in 2019, and then it just kept on rolling, right? 2019, 2021, and 22. Georgia's allowing in the 70s as far as rushing the football is concerned per game. People just knew Georgia wasn't going to let you run the football. You might beat them, but you were going to do it a different way. You were not going to run the ball to beat Georgia. Then 23, 24 comes, we see that trend reverse. So like I said, there's more to it than just a trend. And I touched on the offense and how it plays with the defense. So let's take just a second and let's hit a couple of those years. Let's look at the championship years for Georgia. So we're talking about 2017, 21, 22, and then 24. So in 2017, the Bulldogs offense averaged 35.4 yards per game, points per game. That was good enough for number 20, the 20th ranked overall offense in 2017. Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, Jake Fromm took that team to a national title game. 35 points a game. And if we look at the defensive unit, let me refresh you here. They gave up 126 yards on the ground, finished 20th against the run that year. And they finished 6th overall in scoring defense. So you can see they had a good offense, 30 plus points a game. They could count on it, average 35 points a game. And they had the 6th overall defense. So the two things were working together. Defense not absolutely dominant, offense doing well enough to win with a defense that was playing that good. So you can see how that came together. 2021. In 2021, Georgia rolls out there and puts 38.6 points per game on the board offensively. That was good enough to finish 9th overall for total offense that season. 39 points a game. Like I said, you got to be able to score in the college football playoff era. In 2021, defensively, Georgia gave up 78.9 yards per game on the ground. That was good enough for 2nd in the country. And they had the overall number 1 ranked defense. So now you've got two units that are both top 10, 9 and number 1 overall. The offense and defense were working together. A veteran-led team in 21. They went out there and took care of business. 22, a national championship team, 15-0, one of the best teams in the history of college football. They cranked the volume up a little bit more on that offense, putting 41 points per game on the board. And the defense, they weren't quite as good overall in 22. They finished 5th overall defensively when it comes to scoring. But against the run, the Dogs only give up 77 yards per game on the ground, which was good enough for number 1 overall. So In 22, you had the 5th ranked overall offense and the 1st ranked overall defense. So it's clear why those teams were national champions. The offense and defense were both working together, and they both were top 10 units. In 22, they were both top 5 units. It's clear. But the one thing that has run through all of these numbers so far is that Georgia is at their best when they play their best against the run. In 24, we know that season didn't end with a national championship, but it did end with an SEC title. The offense only put up, I say only because we're looking at the other years here, the other 4 championship seasons in recent memory. They only put up 31.5, 32 points per game. And they only finished 38th offensively. Now, as we saw with the earlier years, you can have a defense that's not top 10 and still play for a national championship. 2017, that's exactly what happened. But in 2024, you had the offense not scoring as much as they had scored in previous seasons. And then when you look at the defensive side of the ball, the run game was at its worst since Kirby's first season. The run defense was at its worst since Kirby's first season in Athens in 2016, finishing 36th, allowing 130 yards on the ground per game defensively. So the offense isn't scoring as much. The defense is giving up more. And that's how you find yourself not ultimately competing for and winning a national championship. Even with all that said, there were enough great parts and enough great players on that team to be a champion. But if you're a Georgia Bulldogs fan and you're looking back at it, how fulfilled are you with last season? We've laid out the numbers. We've walked all the way through it. But how fulfilled are you? I think most Georgia Bulldog fans are going to look at that and say, well, this just isn't a very good team. It's not a good team. Well, the facts are that they actually were a really good team, right? Top 3rd of all of college football, offensively and defensively. The thing is, they just have not been, or they were not as good as they have been in previous seasons. So where do we go from here? How do you solve this problem if you're Kirby Smart? Because he's not happy with it. I mean, yes, he's happy for that team. He's happy for those players. He's happy to win another SEC championship. Hell, I'm ecstatic to win another SEC championship. That's where it starts for me as a Georgia Bulldogs fan. But again, I think everybody wants the program to be right back where it was. And you know this. I've talked about it a lot here on this channel that the sands of college football are ever shifting. So it's getting harder and harder to be able to step in there and repeat the same type of performance year over year over year. But Kirby knows that that's no excuse. He knows that the only thing people care about is wins and then championships. That's what matters. He's done it to himself. He'll be the first one to tell you that. Now, y'all know that I always pump the brakes a little bit and tell you, yes, you can still have an amazing season and not win a national championship. Honestly, I think Georgia had a really, really good season in 2024, and they didn't win a national championship. There are some people who just won't hear that. A lot of those people have been Georgia Bulldog fans since about, 2019. But those of us that have been around for a little while, we know that inside the SEC, winning a conference title, winning double-digit games, giving yourself a chance to play for a national championship, those are all things to be pointed at and admired. Yet, we all feel disappointed, like it's not good enough. Hell of a sport, college football these days, but that's the reality. Kirby knows it. So what do we do to get better? Well, the thing about Kirby is he is on the record as saying, you see it right here, I'll read it out, I love hard work. I like the grind. I'm into doing it better than the other team. Awesome. Don't know a Georgia Bulldog fan who doesn't want to hear that they don't want their head coach to feel that way. That's how I want my dude to feel. So what are we going to do about it? Well, the man has done such good work in Athens. He's earned the benefit of the doubt. We're going to give him that. He knows how to do it. I believe he's going to work. No one is a bigger competitor or works harder or is more involved in his program than Kirby Smart. Just reality. So I don't doubt that he's going to do everything he can do to make that happen. And if you've been paying attention, we just entered the dead period for college football recruiting. But in the window that coaches had to get back out there and go see these coaches around the state and go see these players around the country, Kirby burned the candle at both ends, ran himself ragged. If you follow this stuff, you saw pictures of Kirby out there with all these players and all these coaches at all these high schools across the state of Georgia and beyond. And by the end of it, the last day before the dead period started, you could see it all over him. The man was just flat and worn out. And he was still being a good dad, still going to watch his kids play ball. He's trying to do it all. And he does that because, like me, he loves the University of Georgia. But it does take its toll. But he knows that's what's required because at the end of the day, it's about players. Great scheme is what it is. But it's about players. And then furthermore, once you have great players, it's about want to. If you want to stop the run, it's because you want it more than the other guy. Fact. You have to do all the things you're supposed to do. You have to be fundamentally sound. You have to be a phenomenal football player. You have to be someone who takes coaches. You're in the right place. All of those things. But at the end of the day, it comes down to whether or not I can whip your ass. That's what it comes down to. Or are you going to whip mine? That's how you stop the run. You don't believe me? Roll back through the memories. Think about those teams that I talked to you about from 2019 to 2022. You think about the players on that field. Think about the way they played the game. They were there to win. Not the game, not a bunch of games in a season. They wanted to win every rep. They wanted to make them quit. Those sounds I play off the top of the show, it's because Kirby tells them that's what it requires. That's where those sounds come from. He didn't do that for me in a sound booth somewhere. He did that in a locker room, talking to his players, getting them ready to go out and handle business the way they had to go out and dominate their box, to want it more than their competitor, and to win. Stopping the run is about want to. It's about effort. It's about team effort. And from 2019 to 2022, nobody did that better than the University of Georgia consistently. Nobody. The result, 2 championships. Another SEC championship. So if Georgia's going to win that way again, it has to start in the run game. We'll talk about the offense and their woes on the run side later. It has to start in the rush defense at the University of Georgia. Everything else plays off of that, and it's all based off of the players that you have. Then can they do all the intangible things that you need them to do? And at the center of it all, who wants it more? Well, we know how Kirby feels about it. Again, he is like an open tap when it comes to the motivational comments. And in interviews, I've said it here more than once. You might not like what Kirby Smart has to say, but he's going to tell you the truth. Now, sometimes it takes a minute to sort of sift through it and find the truth. Sometimes he's not as blunt as he is at other times, but he is going to tell you the truth. One of his famous quotes in a recent article with ESPN is, "I want dominance. I don't want to be good. I don't want to be in the game. I don't want to be consistent." I mean, consistency is huge now. Don't get me wrong. I want to be dominant. That is the standard. We talked about goals and standards recently. That is the standard, coming straight from the head man. And when you've got talented veteran players who buy into it as much as the head man, that's how you get what you got from, 2019 to 2022 against the rush. And if Georgia wants to win that way again, that's what it's going to take. If Kirby Smart wants to step out there and hoist trophies the way he's used to doing it, at this point, aren't we all used to seeing him do it? It's going to have to come back to playing rush defense the way we have seen them play it in the past. 113 yards per game on the ground is not awful. It's not embarrassing. It's not garbage. None of that. That's hyperbole spoken by people whom I'd rather not hear from. It's not factually true. That's a solid rush defense, but it is not elite. And from 2019 to 2022, Georgia was elite against the run. You want to know how far Georgia's going to go in 2025? Pay attention to how well they play the run. There's going to be some bumps. There are going to be young players figuring it out on defense for Georgia this year. Remember off the top when I said, which unit is the most important to you? Which one are you most concerned about, most interested in on the defensive side of the football heading into 2025? Think about your answer. Hold on to it, because at the end, we're going to revisit it. Georgia has to stop the run if they're going to be champions. When you think about what happened in the SEC title game in 2024, you're like, how in the world did a team that gave up 130 rush yards per game over the course of the season and finished 36th overall against the run nationally, how did that team show up and beat Texas not once, but twice with everything on the line? It's because they got it up in their head that they were going to dominate the Texas offensive line. They held Texas to 1 yard per carry as an average over both games. One. That is effort. Same players that gave up 130 yards a game the rest of the year. When they showed up, saw the burnt orange, it was a different animal. Some of that has to do with matchup, for sure. But also, it has to do with want to. Texas has first-round offensive linemen on that team. Texas had an offense that could throw it all over the yard, and everybody was worried about getting beat over the top and in the pass game and all that kind of stuff. But Georgia showed up, brought a big old hammer, and just smashed it all to pieces. They were always good enough physically. They just couldn't dial it in all the time the way they could against Texas. And it's perplexing. It's enough to drive you crazy, honestly. If you're a Georgia fan like us, you're like, where is this team every week? I don't know. We can talk about that from now to forever. Players, as they move on, they'll go back and look back on the 2024 season, and maybe they'll share insights with us about why things were the way they were. And I'm talking about the intangibles here, because we all know that there were injuries that played into it and all that sort of thing, and that happens for every team, so it is what it is. But the difference when Georgia played Texas is they just set their mind that they weren't going to give up anything on the ground, and they didn't. And then Georgia, in spite of their diminished offensive output, based on injuries, based on players not being there that they thought they were going to have, based on having to bring in a backup quarterback at halftime, they still were able to do the things that they needed to do to win the game. They couldn't do that if it hadn't been for the performance of that defense against the run. Because if Texas can run the ball at all, that game doesn't go that way. But they couldn't. The game in Texas, same thing. If they could run at all, that game probably doesn't go that way. But they couldn't. So, how many times did Georgia beat Texas in 2024? I can remind you. 2. If Georgia wants to get back to this, it's clear that what they have to do is get back to shutting down the run in a way that they did between 2019 and 2022. I'm not saying they have to be that dominant. but you have to reverse the trend. In 2016, that number was up at 144 yards a game. What happened in 2017? It came down 20 yards a game. They reversed the trend. A blip in 18, it goes back up a little bit. But then in 19, it's like it fell off the table. From 134 yards a game all the way down to 75. That's not just scheme. That's not just great players. It's a combination of all that stuff and the buy-in and the attitude that it takes to be good against the run. That's what Georgia has to capture. That's what they have to get back to. So again, Kirby knows this. How do you do it? We've seen him. He's out there recruiting the very best players he can find across the country. We know that's his approach. We know that's how he wants to build his team, through traditional recruiting. So he's doing that part. He's putting in that work. The next part is when you're on the grass, cleats in the dirt, you got to get better every day. You got to focus on it. You have to build that toughness through spring, through summer camp, through the season as much as you can, so you don't lose your edge. You have to understand what the standard is. And again, standards and goals, right? Everybody wants to be good against the run. That's a goal. But what is your standard? Georgia's going to have to recalibrate those standards as a program heading into 2025. There's no two ways around it. Kirby knows it. You can see there is a standard. We do it this way. So those young players that we don't know all of them yet, they may be really good. They may be exactly what Georgia needs to get back to being the kind of rush defense that we expect them to be. Thing is, they haven't had an opportunity to play a whole lot yet, but they're going to have to grow up in a hurry. And then they're going to have to show up. And they're going to take their lumps. But the thing I want to see is that change in direction. I want to see that change in attitude. I want to see on the perimeter, our DBs, safeties, outside linebackers are blowing people up if they throw those bubble screens out there. Block destruction in space. If you're trying to run between the tackles or you're trying to run a little bit of a lead situation, I want to see our linebackers in the hole. I want to see them bringing the hammer, going for the stalemate. I want to see our defensive linemen not getting moved off the line of scrimmage. I want to see them hold their gap. We're going to know as we watch the team play whether we can expect them to be good against the run because of how they play. You cannot hide the effort. So we're going to know. And if Georgia's going to get back to this, if Georgia's going to get back to the top, if they're going to get back to being King Georgia, the way everybody in college football viewed them in the not too distant past, it's going to be because they consistently bow their back, say hell no, and stop the run the way they did from 2019 to 2022. Again, they don't have to push that number all the way back down into the 70s, but they certainly cannot live in the range of 130 to 140 yards a game and expect that they're going to be champions. And who knows, this defense, even if they're only in the top 20 in 2025, that might be good enough because we also don't know what we don't know about the offense. When they play it in tandem and they're putting up 30, 35, 40 points a game, that covers a lot of warts on the defensive side. And then you just have to be great when you're great, when your best is needed, right? In the key moments, that's when all those other numbers like scoring defense and red zone defense and third down defense and tackles for loss, that's when all those things come into play because it becomes situational at that point. So it works both ways. The offense can cover you. They can give you a little shade, a little protection, or they can hinder your efforts, right? you're not getting off the field fast enough, and then your offense is not staying on the field to give you a rest. It all works hand in hand. That's the simple reality of it. But the bottom line is, if Georgia's going to get back to being the Georgia that we all want them to be, the data is clear. They have to be better against the run more consistently than they have been the last 2 seasons. So remember that question that I asked off the top. What's the most important defensive metric, the most important defensive position in your mind going into 2025? Is it this young defensive line that we don't know yet? Is it the linebackers that are supposed to be able to run free and make tackles? Is it that secondary that you're afraid is going to get burnt and the priority is we have to be able to play well against the pass? Or is it like the data tells us that it's probably the defensive line and how well that unit as a whole plays against the run that's going to tell the tale for Georgia in 2025? That's the metric I'm going to be looking at. That's the group I'm going to be looking at. And I think that is going to tell me more than anything else what I can ultimately expect this team in 2025 to be. So please drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. Do you think it's the D-line, linebackers, the secondary? Do you think it's whether or not we can get after the passer? Do you think it's red zone scoring that's going to ultimately tell the tale? For me, it's how well the Dogs play the run. If the Georgia Bulldogs want to be who we all want them to be, the dominant team that we saw from 2021, 22, then they have to get better at playing the run. They have to do better than they've done the last 2 seasons. They have to get better at dictating and demanding that other teams play the way Georgia wants them to play. How do you do that? You make them one-dimensional. The way Georgia has done that under Kirby Smart is to not let them run the football. If Georgia's going to be what we want them to be, they have to get back to playing dominant, elite rush defense. And the sooner they do that, the sooner that my Georgia Bulldogs are going to be back in the national championship game. Go Dogs!
Told them, how about them fucking dogs? That's what I told them.